Wait for okay. Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order. I'm Ron Califf, the chairman. Let me introduce briefly our members of the committee. John Russell is one of our newer members. Bob Collins is with the Center for the Inland Bays. Matt Kirks, right next to me, lives right over here on one of the streets that brings the water very close to his house. Bruce Fry lives pretty close to that sort of thing too.
Yeah, I think we all
As does Chip.
He's in the water.
Yep, as is Chip Smith. And our speaker for today is going to be Ed Hale, but I'll get to that in just a minute. Also here from the town is Terry Tiemann, our assistant town manager. Will Wharton, our IT manager, is here, as well as Chrissy Ray, the town clerk. First of all, I'd like to, do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I make a motion, yes.
Okay. How about second? Okay. Those in favor? Any discussion? Those in favor? Aye. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from our last meeting back in January?
Motion to that.
Second?
Second.
Okay. Those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Going to move on to, actually, we're going to go directly into our speaker for today, who is Ed Hale, a University of Delaware assistant professor. Oh, excuse me. Also, a member of our committee, Jack Gordon.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm late.
Okay. Ed Hale, a University of Delaware assistant professor involved in the UDel aquaculture and aquaponics at the university in Lewis. He's involved with several current studies to develop nature-based resilient shorelines for our Back Bay and Bay Shore areas, all to provide greater resilience to coastal storms. Thank you for being here, Ed. We look forward to your presentation. I am kind of rushing into it because Ed's got some obligations he has to get to a little later in the afternoon. So.
Thank you very much, Ron. I appreciate it. I have to pick up my daughter at 3:40 in Lewis. So I have to get from traffic around 3 to there and then go teach at 5:30. So.
Okay, important things.
Yeah, just trying to keep it all together, to be honest. I really appreciate the invitation. I saw in your meeting minutes that you had Rob Nicholson from the Blue Economy in January, which is fantastic. I am focused on aquaculture and fisheries. That is my subject matter expertise. So I have an affiliation with Delaware Sea Grant.
Ed, could you bring the microphone a little closer?
I typically try and stay away from them, to be honest. Hide in a corner. So I'm with the University of Delaware. I'm also with the Delaware Sea Grant program. And so I engage in marine extension outward to fisheries and shellfish aquaculture producers. I'm involved in a lot of different research projects, and I work with a really big number of different people, and I think it's important to kind of give them credit up front. This is a group, pretty long list. I'm going to kind of provide you with a snapshot of all the different individuals we have. One of them just walked through the door, Mimi DuPont. She's a big help. Thank you, Mimi. Perfect timing. So we've been engaged in some planning efforts. We have a pilot scale oyster hatchery where we've actually been producing oysters. You may have read this in the news. We have a number of different research efforts, as Ron mentioned, aimed at examining living shorelines and increased shoreline stabilization. This is not a new technique. People have been using living shorelines, engineered living shorelines for at least a few decades. The center has been involved with this type of approach. It is one potential pathway in lieu of, or potentially in addition to, hard armoring and infrastructure. And so it's a green modification in that you're using potentially seeding areas with shellfish, oysters, rib mussels, but also plants to aid in sedimentation and avoid erosion. And so you can control stream bank erosion, which is actually pretty helpful. So aquaculture is one of these cool things that we talk about that has a pretty wide host of benefits. I am traditionally a fisheries guy, a pretty hardcore like population dynamics, catch a lot of animals, tag a lot of animals. When I moved into aquaculture, I'd been studying oysters, and it's pretty fantastic to me just to see all the different ecosystem services rendered, talking about juvenile fish production, blue crabs, tautog, black sea bass, things that people recreationally fish for, utilize oyster farm habitat, cages, as juvenile nurseries. And so, as you're all probably well aware, the bays don't look the same as they did 50 years ago. There's overall been a reduction in seagrass. There's overall been a reduction in available subtidal inshore habitat, right, through various different activities. And so, not to kind of blame any one activity, but this is a way to actually help benefit the environment, and I'll talk about how. I won't rattle off that name, but there's a lot of people involved in this work. And so if you have questions about a specific application or component that I talk about, I'm happy to kind of talk to and give credit there. So yeah, we'll jump in, hopefully.
Do you mind if I turn that screen a little bit? We can't see it.
Sure.
Is it off? Oh, there we go.
Excuse me one moment, we can't see from the screen. Yeah, it's at a bad angle. Well, we can't see this. It's the same.
Yeah, I think he's going to
Well,
change both of them.
He's moving on over there. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a little bit about my professional background. I like to kind of talk about what I've done and where I'm from, just so you understand some of the context. Have a PhD actually from our Lewis-based Marine Studies campus. If you haven't been to it, I encourage you all to visit. Hopefully most of you have been there for a coast day. I've been around the block a bit in terms of education and research. I've held 4 or 5 different adjunct faculty appointments. And at my latest stint, I actually worked with the Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife doing stock assessments. So I was one of the people that would take field data and mathematically compute abundance and examine how regulations and changes would actually affect fishing harvests as well as abundance and trends through time. So really pretty cool quantitative expression. Now, of course, I jumped from the state of Delaware, DENEREC, to the Sea Grant office, was involved in marine extension, and grew into an assistant faculty role there, assistant professorship, looking at largely the same things that I've been looking at for 20-some years. Oyster aquaculture was kind of new, but I had been studying oyster recruitment since 2003. So it's been a little while, but a lot of the same factors are interested. It's just now there's new farming-based applications. Do some work with diadromous fishes, including Atlantic sturgeon, American shad, striped bass, things you have probably fished for at one point or another that are seeing population reductions. Also work with apex predators, including some sandbar sharks, sand tiger sharks, caught hammerheads. Delaware Bay, it turns out, is a pretty hot area for shark activity, the mouth of it. Makes sense. It's a large coastal plain estuary that kind of dumps out a tremendous amount of productivity in the form of forage fish, Atlantic menhaden and bunker. And so a lot of these sharks have life history stages that are actually tied to Delaware Bay. And so for me, it's kind of quite natural to study that. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see just some random extension-based opportunities. We actually had the picture most left, bottom left, is a shellfish forum. We host annual meetings open to the public for our shellfish farmers, but also to communicate with DENEREC, a number of different divisions, and Delaware State University, and that's my colleague, Dennis McIntosh there. So that's just a snapshot of who I am, where I've come from, and what I do now. I'm hopeful to kind of get at a pretty broad-based introduction of what fisheries are, what aquaculture is, just for context, and then I'll provide a little bit of information too on some of our ongoing research that is aimed at looking at sustainability. So a fishery, right? I'm up here talking to you about fisheries and aquaculture, and some of you might not know what that means. Fishery, blankly, is just any activity leading to harvest. It's very much reductive in nature. There is a component of mortality associated with this. What's interesting about fisheries is that it can be either wild fish or hatchery reared, and so it can actually encompass aquaculture, which is just the production of fish, right? Typically, we define this unit in some of either the people species, right? You might have heard of like the New England groundfish fishery, which fishes for cod. That's an area where you can talk about small fisheries, small boat, sea scallop fisheries. So there's different ways that we kind of characterize it, but in general, they're all after the same thing, which is harvest. And a lot of that is pretty common. So why should you care? That's kind of the $1 million point, and I mean $1 million point. I care because of healthy ecosystems, right? This is why I study what I study. Even aquaculture, I'm after ecosystem services. I'm trying to understand how juvenile fish interact with aquaculture gear. But there's also some important considerations in terms of global dietary needs. A significant proportion of the world's population is actually dependent on fisheries. Not so much here, but you look at the developing world, particularly some of the island nations in the Pacific region, largely dependent on fish, right? Economic value. If you don't care about healthy ecosystems or feeding people, that's fine, but you probably care about money at some point. Most of us have to deal with it. So at a national level, we're talking about $212 billion in sales. This is combined commercial and recreational saltwater fishing activities. This is economic impacts. U.S. estimates this every year, and so we can actually generate these figures. They're specific to Delaware. We have about $116 million to the state of Delaware generated in economic impact every year, give or take 4 or 5 million, and about 10 to 15 million in commercial impact associated with ex-vessel value. Those two metrics are not measured the same. Recreational fishing is actually measured with, they include things like boat sales, fuel, petrol at bait stations, these types of things. So it's a little bit different. Whereas commercial value is largely just value of product, not ancillary business services. But important kind of context, right? We're talking about billions of dollars of value to a national scale, millions of dollars to our state. And if you want a really extreme example, a single bluefin tuna is actually worth about $3 million. That's about $5,000 a pound for about 12,000 pieces of sushi. So pretty fantastic when you consider just the total value of what we're talking about here. I like to kind of point these things out up front so that you understand we're not talking about trivial matters. Money matters, and most people, regardless of where you live, care about that. All right, so what do we use in Delaware? In Delaware, our commercial fishing is a little bit smaller than our recreational fishing impact. You probably know a far number. You could probably count 10 recreational anglers on, that you're aware of. But I would venture to guess most of you don't interact with commercial fishers too frequently. There's not that many of them. There's less than probably about a couple hundred. I know there's 140 different registered net fishers for striped bass alone. And I'm willing to kind of talk to anybody who wants to talk about differential levels of mortality associated with those two fisheries. That's something that I actually study. So yeah, you can see these two different gear types. Largely, we have dredge fisheries out in Delaware Bay associated with harvesting crabs. We have blue crab pot fishery, right? Blue crabs is our #1 fishery in the state. We've had small levels of harvest for eels. You can see these eel traps. We also do some whelk fishing down in Lewis area, out in Delaware Bay and out front. And then we anchor and drift gill nets, and those are mesh panels of nets that are very effective at capturing striped bass. Most of those are used in the Port Mahon, Delaware Bay area, but this, again, just provides you with a little bit of an overview of some of the gear types that we're using. So what's our commercial value added look like? As I said, it's about $16 million. As opposed to our recreational fishery, it's about $110 million. Now, keep in mind, those two metrics aren't equivocal. You're not comparing apples and apples. It's apples and oranges. But you get a sense of the total value in any given year is somewhere in the neighborhood of $126 million. So that's pretty cool background. Historically, Delaware Bay and Delaware in particular have been a really dominant factor in the region. Really, Lewis was founded as a commercial whaling port before Cape Cod, when you really look at the history. And most of Cape May, that now represents developed Cape May, was developed as ancillary businesses for whaling activities. Oil, reduction, processing, all these things evolved out of commercial fishing, and it's really neat to kind of consider the history of this in our own state, which is really pretty rich. All right, so we've talked about fishing, or I've talked to you about fisheries. It's probably helpful to now talk about aquaculture, given that's what I'm here to actually talk about. Important to kind of denote that aquaculture is considered a farming activity. That's why you'll see different groups, including the Delaware Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, get involved, because aquaculture falls under their umbrella as well. Farming implies some level of intervention. Either you're seeding animals or you're reducing the mortality of animals. At any given rate, you can imagine it like an Easter farm or an Easter egg hunt, right? You have 100 eggs, you put 100 eggs out, you expect 100 eggs, unless a bunch of kids come and gobble up your eggs. So this is what happens, right? In aquaculture, we put out oysters, principally. That's what we're farming here in the first state. We put out oysters, we multiply some level of mortality coefficient, anticipating some level of mortality, and in a year or two, we expect to have so many oysters available for sale. So the oyster farmer then predicts. What's troubling, or what's been hard for these folks, is that Delaware is the second to last state to actually engage in this activity. Kind of weird, because there was actually a transplant fishery up until 1979, but when you look back, that was shuttered because we were worried about interrupting commercial harvest of clams in the inland bays. So folks have a history of aquaculture activities in Delaware's inland bays. And so I like to point out that this isn't a new idea, rather it's just a rebirth of an old one, which is kind of pretty neat again. So yeah, farming does imply some level of individual or corporate ownership, and so there's this kind of thing, this commodity that you own, and it's a little bit different from a fishery that is considered a natural trust resource out there swimming around. Here's what our aquaculture production looks like in total. Overall, we're about $1.5 billion. 430 of that is in the marine environment. Most of that is largely attributable to bivalves. So we're talking about clams and oysters. Oysters, in fact, are the #1 most lucrative marine cultured organism, period, in terms of unit value, worth about 60 to 75 cents per oyster. When you're farming them properly. And then you can kind of compare that to total 658 million pounds of total production in both the marine and freshwater environments. Consider this, globally, tilapia, one species, is more than double that number in terms of total production. So when we talk about things like fisheries and aquaculture and production, it's kind of easy to make connections to trade deficits. And to look at broader ecological and economic impact. And so I like to kind of continue to bring that out. When we look at where things are being grown, large proportion of it occurs in the Atlantic. Turns out we've been growing oysters since the 1980s. Maryland had a bit of a jump on us. We started in 2017. So we're a little late. So yeah, we're relatively new, I'd say brand new, but we have folks selling. So we're relatively new to the oyster industry when we compare it to some of our states up and down the East Coast. Our leasing lottery opened in 2017. I have a little shooter on this guy, little laser. I can't see. But largely, there's 3 areas in Rehoboth Bay proper, and you can see they're gridded out. They represent individual 1-acre plots. 3 of these, one's in Sally's Cove, and then 2 of them are actually behind Del Seashore through the permit process. Some folks didn't want to see them behind neighborhoods, and so that's where they're actually located. There's another one in Indian River Bay, and then there is an aquaculture area in Little Assawoman Bay, but nobody is using either of those 2 areas. Instead, most of our efforts are actually centered in Rehoboth Bay, so it's kind of cool to note. Another local connection. As of 2022, we have 9 commercial leases. So again, relatively small. We've harvested about 344,000 oysters. We've planted about 1.5 million. And so every year we get a little bit more. We're kind of like the little kid learning how to walk. But we've hosted a couple of different forums, openly and publicly, to kind of discuss how to advance shellfish aquaculture in Rehoboth Bay and identify how to make it more successful. If you talk to our industry, largely there's 3 potential stipulations that are inhibiting the increase of production and enhancing economic activity. Number 1 is regulatory or regulation in nature. I won't get into that one. That's not my arena. I have opinions, but I'm really not supposed to share them. Number two is oyster seed availability. So one of the hatcheries that the folks used to purchase seed oysters from, and when people purchase seed oysters for this activity, they're purchasing an oyster that's approximately 2 millimeters in size. Oyster hatchery is fairly technical application. We produce oysters by strip spawning them, getting them to settle on little grains of sand, and then they grow on individual seed. And so if you ever hear somebody say, oh, that's a seed oyster, it means it was purchased as an individual, not as a cluster. And so Delaware Bay farms oysters too. They do remote setting, so they'll transplant oyster larvae to the bottom, and they'll grow in these kind of abject little clusters. In the inland bays, we're talking about sea-based culture in cages, and so the application is a little bit different. And so, yeah, so these are some of the challenges. And then the third is accessibility to loans. Other states, including Maryland, have a loan-based program that's publicly chartered. It's called Marbidco. Pretty neat economic program. It's an incentive to provide loans for aquaculture development. We do not have anything like that in this state. It takes about $100,000 in initial startup costs to start an oyster farm. So it's not a cheap endeavor. It requires a significant amount of work and a significant amount of time on the water. You can imagine who has access to $100,000 of liquid capital. They probably look like me and a little bit older, right? So when we talk about things like diversity and that type of thing, it's not there. It's largely a white elderly man, older man, I shouldn't call him elderly, an older folk thing. And so that's what we're seeing. And so we're trying to identify strategies in which we can actually bring folks into this so that we can continue sustainable seafood production. One of the things I'll talk about is just the overall benefits in a second. But here's what some of our oysters look like if you haven't seen it. If you're heading southbound on 1 after you leave Dewey, before you get to Bethany Beach, if you just check right before Clark's Old Inlet, Bait and Tackle, you'll see a bunch of white poles and buoys. That is your oyster aquaculture gear at work. People are growing oysters. They're for sale in Fins. They're for sale in Henlopen City. We had them at the Lewis Fish House. Our folks, our individual farmers, have had issues with supply and production, producing at a scale, frankly, that some of our coastal restaurants can sustain. We do not have anybody big enough to make enough oysters to make one of these oyster restaurants happy. And a large part of that has to do with supply. And so that's why the University of Delaware has gotten involved in trying to bring an oyster hatchery to fruition. This is another interesting retrospective history. One of the buildings associated with the Lewis Marine Studies campus was actually constructed for an oyster hatchery. And we kind of walked away from that. I guess in the late 80s, really, we started to shift to genetics research. We had some folks at Sea Grant kind of continuing to do some hatchery style work, but it really wasn't formalized. And so, again, we're trying to regrow this. And so we started to plan for a pilot scale oyster hatchery where we could produce our own oyster seed to kind of share with shellfish farmers, also share with nonprofit groups engaged in oyster restoration, which is kind of a goal of ours, and conduct applied research. And we're doing that with a partnership of different people, including Delaware State University, and a number of different plannings. You can see this particular parcel. That's the U.S. Coast Guard base, if you're familiar with Roosevelt Inlet. And then that's the former it's the current pollution ecology lab. And our area is in approximately 800 square feet. It's about a shed. And we are making some big strides in the shed and planning toward a much larger facility. This is our initial hatchery success. I had notes, but I don't have presenter view. I think we made about 43 million individual oyster larvae in our first season, 8 broods. Our target goal was actually 50 million, and we gave ourselves three years to do that. And so, we've already made 45 million. So I'd like to point out, we're well ahead of what we thought we would do, but I want to do more. That's kind of a problem. I want to be able to put oysters in the hands of our shellfish farmers, hopefully as soon as possible. But you can see some of our activities there. If you drive by Broadkill River and you're headed to the Lewis Boat Ramp, if you see the building next to MER, the Marine Mammal Rescue Center, that's us. we're making oysters there, and we do that all summer long. We have a great group of people. Our hatchery coordinator, Alyssa Campbell, is effectively the director of operations on a day-to-day basis. And you can see a number of different activities. Remember, I told you about remote setting oysters? So that's what this looks like. It doesn't produce the nice manicured oyster that you would want at a fine restaurant. Instead, it grows into this cluster. And that would actually be deposited in Delaware Bay. So it's another farming technique, in addition to growing individual oysters, which are what these folks are on the second picture from the right. This is actually an oyster. Might be hard to believe, but it is. There's actually 3 in the view plane. And so we're producing single seed oysters. We're producing larvae for distribution. And we actually sent 100,000 oysters out to Delaware Bay, hopefully for commercial production in a 2 to 3 year time frame. This year we're trying to focus on seed production, see if we can get that done. We'd really like to hit 1 million. That's kind of the goal, but we'll see where we're going from there. As I said, this is a pilot scale facility. It's really a proof of concept. We're partnered with National Aquarium, but also with Delaware State University, working with Delaware Tech to kind of communicate how we can grow workforce development and local school districts. We're working with Indian River School District, particularly a woman named Renee Jerns over at Sussex Central. Casey Revels and Jason Stockley, I think, are a couple of teachers. So we're actually putting aquaculture and fisheries into classrooms, which is kind of fantastic. It's really this multi-pronged effect. What we'd like to do is build something called a Fisheries and Aquaculture Innovation Center that aims to provide workforce development, but also research opportunities. Again, we'd really like to do a number of different things. We're working with a bunch of coastal landscape architects now to see how we can do that, how we can utilize the space, all with under the auspices of trying to identify new pathways for curriculum development at a collegiate level, but also at an academic K through 12 setting. We have 2 grant partnerships, 2 grants right now secured to do this with Indian River. They're going to be tagging fish and doing cool oyster growth experiments, and so we've been communicating with them. We have a number of different partnerships identified. All of this is heavy partnerships. You saw the list of folks and their various affiliations identified with planning, with looking at feasibility studies. This is what we're working on now to try and grow this vision. This is a conceptual rendering of what the Fisheries and Aquaculture Innovation Center could look like. This is not certified through an official architect. Rather, it's from the Coastal Resilience Design Studio. Cool Sea Grant funded program hosted by landscape architect students to develop these types of conceptual renderings just for this type of application to see how things fit in, to identify plantings and different strategies for water mitigation. If we're going to build a 10,000 square foot structure, we need to figure out where we're going to put rainwater, how we're going to deal with storm surge, and how we're going to effectively serve our production targets for what we want to do from an aquaculture setting. So we have a need to feed the people, but we also want to understand the impacts, right? And that's kind of where some of my research comes in. Our human population is rising dramatically. I talked to you about the interest in food production. Aquaculture is not alone. Aquaculture is a rather, particularly shellfish-based aquaculture, is a green practice. There is a carbon footprint. You do spend gas to get to it in a boat. But when you look at the totality of the operation environmentally, it's extremely positive, which is kind of interesting. So we're looking at rates of population growth in developing countries. Standard of living for a lot of people can be very low. And one of the issues is how do we adequately feed the burgeoning population? You're not going to do that with oyster aquaculture, right? Oyster aquaculture is affiliated with feeding people here at coastal restaurants with white linens. But aquaculture in general is how we can actually get to meet some of these challenges because we're not reliant on terrestrial input, right? And so we have to actually critically address what we call food security. This is a new concept, but it's not alien to other countries. In fact, if you look at Norway, Denmark, and some of the Scandinavian countries, they produce food not just for the well-being and commercial applications, but for national security. So it's an interesting kind of political dogma or viewpoint that I kind of like to just point out. we're talking about developing wind farms. I know this is a sticking topic. In association with wind farms is the potential to grow offshore sugar kelp and mussels. Both of these groups of organisms are green. Kelp is actually seeded in a laboratory and grows on a rope. That's the beginning and end of kelp production. Macroalgae in general is incredibly environmentally beneficial. Imagine being able to grow lettuce without adding any nitrogen, phosphorus. You just go out and take a sprinkle of lettuce seed or a grass seed, and then you would have potential harvest. This is effectively what kelp and macroalgae production can do. There is associated efforts, in terms of what we can do there. But when we look on like a global impact, right, and ways in which we can actually reduce nitrogen and phosphorus, we know that macroalgae production and bivalve aquaculture, mussels, clams, scallops, and oysters will retain and sequester nitrogen and phosphorus. That is actually one of the benefits to having them in the inland bays, which are rich in nitrogen and phosphorus associated with terrestrial agricultural runoff, right? And so it's one of these strategies that we can use. I don't know if I can get to my video, and that's okay. Really, it's just a neat video that I like to present so people can actually see for themselves how these organisms interact. This is like 6 or 7 different black sea bass kind of floating along and using this oyster cage as habitat, right? And so I like to point this stuff out and talk about it, and I study it in terms of biomass, length frequencies, and a bunch of other boring metrics that you probably don't care about. But I can show you 30 seconds of video and say, hey, this is important. Look what it does for habitat. That wasn't there before. And then you can walk away and go, yeah, that must have done something, right? So you can see it. I really think that's cool. So we have these kind of historical estimates. My lab group is trying to understand what the real impact of this is. So we know that there's an increase in diversity. We know that there's some general increase in biomass, but nobody's really quantified that yet, and nobody's really studying how animals might shift between cages, and if they're using them as isolated halos, ecological halos, or if they're using them as a network. And so we're trying to understand that. This is some of our most recent work. So how can Delaware oyster aquaculture support ecosystem function, both in terms of habitat provisioning for aquatic communities, but also potential erosion. So these are the metrics that I'm studying, right? Trying to understand how farmed oyster production varies in different areas of Delaware Bay, trying to understand how changes in biomass and abundance occur across different structures, and then trying to understand population and community scale interactions. It would be really helpful for me to stand up here and say that oyster cage produced so many pounds of blue crab or so many pounds of black sea bass, because then that's a tangible benefit that most people can understand. We're also looking at how to provide shoreline services. How do we prevent erosion with living shoreline, green and hybrid-based strategies in terms of habitat enhancement? This is, again, one of these things that I mentioned early on, but it's not novel. It's probably of interest to many of the folks that might live in the back bays that are experiencing increases in sea surface height and erosion on the stream bank associated with increased wave activity. One of the strategies is to actually use shellfish-based restoration activities. Simply seeding areas with bags of oysters like you see here. These are some pictures from the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary up in the top left. You can see it's a time series. So in 2014, they built a bunch of castles, effectively out of cinder blocks. Cinder blocks are seeded with oyster bags, and from there, 5 years later, you can actually measure recruitment of oysters. And so we can actually see a change in the landscape. I am working on a number of different projects on that avenue right now to critically identify how wave attenuation is dampened. So how does the actual water movement get affected by that structure? And how do animals use those interstitial crevices for habitat production, which I think is really kind of fantastic to me, but you all might not care that much. I think what's cool from an immediate sense, right, is that you can actually use these green strategies in places like Lewis and places like Bethany Beach and other areas to implement a way to retain sediment and decrease erosive forces, which is kind of a big critical point that I thought was pretty salient to bring up to you all. This is not alone. Oysters are not the only salvation, right? Things like wetland buffers help reduce nutrient concentrations into freshwater tributaries, but oysters directly filter water. Laboratory studies estimate maximum 53 gallons. Everybody wants to quote 50, it's actually 53. When you look at the wild, it's way less. It's 12 to 15 gallons per day or per hour of filtration benefit. That filtration filters out phytoplankton high in nitrogen and phosphorus. So the animal actually withdraws it, cleans the water, purifies it, and reduces wave activity. So there's a series of associated benefits to oyster farming and to encouraging oyster restoration that I really like to kind of talk about. This is for our experimental study. So we ran this last year just to look at how different farmed oysters as well as recruitment impacted the local aquatic community. So this is the UD boat basin here. This would be Roosevelt Inlet right about here. You can see a number of different experimental sites. There's no quiz or test afterwards. I'm not worried about it. What I want you to understand is that this is a fairly simple process of oyster aquaculture, one that's applied commercially in the state of New Jersey and elsewhere to grow oysters in intertidal environments. So you actually place an oyster bag on a relatively shallow iron rebar frame, go out and weekly control for biofouling and this type of thing. What we're doing differently from a commercial production is monitoring water quality, looking at oyster growth, looking at recruitment of wild oysters, and then comparing fish and invertebrate abundance and biomass so that we can get at that quantitative expression. You know, what is the actual realized impact? Turns out that growth is affected in farmed oysters by both tidal position, so whether or not you're in subtidal environments versus an intertidal environment, right? One that experiences desiccation or one that's perpetually underwater, as well as farmed strain of oysters. This makes sense, right? DBX is a farm strain from Delaware Bay. NEH is actually a New England high salinity strain, so they have different habitat preferences based on their breeding traits. There's different plants, right, like zone 5, not real good with terrestrial. I should have stayed away from botany. But yeah, so you can get the idea. Generally, there's some differences in terms of performance. And so if we're going to do this on any type of restoration or production scale, these are the types of things that you like to see so that you can actually point to a particular oyster and go, that strain will work here, that one won't. And so we can actually take a look at that. We didn't see, however, that recruitment greatly affected it. This is largely a function of how oysters spawn and reproduce. Oysters are broadcast spawners. They'll reduce millions of eggs and sperm into the water, and they kind of drift around for a period of weeks before settling out. But what's a potential caveat to this is that oysters like to recruit on other oyster shells. So the more shell opportunities you put in the water, the higher your potential recruitment. All right, so we actually saw increases in habitat provision. This slide is not dramatic. These are representative of all the different species that we saw. What's cool is we should have a cobia up here. I don't see him. All right, we had a juvenile cobia actually use a gear, number of different American eels spot, things like blue crabs, a number of different shrimp, jacks, things that didn't occur. I think we saw mahi this year, juvenile mahi, a lot of different stuff, all within a relatively small spatial footprint because there's not a whole lot of available habitat outside of that, right? So you're creating this habitat. There's some theoretical discussion as to whether or not you're sparking new habitat or if you're acting as a sink from other pelagic environments. We're going to work on that one, but regardless, you're providing habitat, which is kind of the cool critical component here. All right, so I've talked enough, I think, and I hope I have enough time for questions. If not, Ron, I apologize, but I'll hit you with these final points. Oyster aquaculture gear leads to a positive change in water quality, leads to a positive increase in water clarity. It leads to habitat and improvements in diversity and biomass, right? Plant an oyster and you improve the environment. That's what I want to leave you with. Aquaculture activities and living shorelines can attenuate waves. They will not help you in the event that a storm surge is overtopping an oyster environment, but they attenuate waves and accumulate sediment in terms of preventing erosion. So you can actually use aquaculture-based practices to reduce erosion. And I think that was one of the most critical points that I was kind of asked to talk about. You can actually do that. Time for questions, or no? I got to run out of here and get out.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Are you seeing I noticed the increase in aquaponics, the farmers up in the Indian River Bay are increasing, but not very much. Do you foresee that? I know you've had close relationship with them, and I know there's a lot of efforts going on, but I saw between 2022 and 2023, there was just an increase in one additional farmer. Do you see that progressing a little more than that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I should have included a slide to that. So when we look at total available habitat, right, total available shellfish aquaculture development areas, we have, I think, 323. State of Rhode Island has 380, I think.
Yeah.
200 different farming applications, $7 million industry. We're hitting 355. We're lucky to hit $500,000 this year. We have a lot of room to grow, and I think that's why there's something called this legislative task force. There's actually, after trying to increase oyster production, both for the ancillary habitat benefits, but also for commercial applications. We see this as a potential growing point. If you talk to the shellfish farmers, the ones that have stuck through it, they recognize there's a lot of room for regulatory improvement, but there's also challenges on seed supply. Hooper's Island was one of the hatcheries that a lot of our different oyster farmers, our 9 folks, used, and Hooper's Island closed last year. And so what we're trying to do is to provide oyster seed for an industry that could and should grow, and frankly has the economic potential to do so. And again, the regulatory bit I stay out of. I'll talk to you about science. But yeah, I certainly think we can do that. I think we need to, right? I think it's a function of improving water quality. And that is, again, it's one of these areas where if you improve water quality, that enhances tourism, that enhances everyone's life quality. So I think that's where it needs to go.
So you foresee it growing. I know there was a forum where they were pushing it into schools, and you mentioned that. Are we getting interest in it? Much interest in it?
Yeah, I've had a lot of interest in aquaculture.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I didn't think there would be. But it turns out what's neat about aquaculture, right, is that you can take a student and I can teach them applied mathematics with fisheries and aquaculture, and I can teach plumbing. And there's not many fields of science where you can realistically do that, right? I can teach you computer programming and how to monitor water quality using advanced sensors and satellites, and I can teach you how to keep something alive in a net. That's what's cool. So there's a direct learning component that focuses on not just advanced academic research, but also in realistic workforce development in our state, and I think that's kind of fantastic.
Yeah, it's hard work, and I've had the opportunity to be out on the oyster beds, and it's amazing how clear the water is, and how the effects that the direct effects that you see right there on improving the water quality of the bays. So,
Agreed. Yeah.
Are the hatchery, are you providing, what portion of that is, are the beds up here, are you providing to them? I know that they were getting it from Virginia and other areas before, but are we biting into that to take a good portion of it?
Yes. Well, that has been it has been the most requested thing out of me, right? I present all this great information and facts, and people want oysters. That's what they need. And so we are very much endeavoring to be able to be viable in the next year or two. We would love to give away 1 million oysters this year. We produced 45 million larvae. We had 9 million larvae go out the door. So there's a 2 to 3 week survival period. It's a pretty detailed process, but there's effectively a logarithmic reduction in survival through time. Of those 9 million, 3 million were actually competent. So we made 45 million total larvae. Great, we almost hit our target. only 3 million of them are competent. And that's not a function on our performance. We hit the metric, or we're getting close to the metric. That's a function on survival. So we're working now to try and figure that out. We've actually had 2 oyster spawns already this year. So we've had some diploid and triploid production. Triploid is one of these words that people throw around, but it's an additional chromosomal set. People worry about polyploidy and genetically modified organisms, and it's not true. If you eat your strawberries, they're polyploids. They have extra sets of chromosomes. That's what makes them big. So when you produce a triploid oyster, a lot of times we use heat shock to do that, and all we're doing is getting the oyster to focus on growing its normal somatic body cells versus gamete or sex cells.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do we have
Can I-
any?
Can I
Please.
ask a couple? And Ed, I know you said you didn't want to get into the regulatory at all, but I am going to ask you a couple of regulatory questions. Because it does seem like, particularly the Division of Fish and Wildlife does not want to see oysters being used in more, in non-food related things. For example, you talked about seeding living shorelines that had oysters in there. I know that the permits that I see prohibit them from being seeded that way. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of, why Fish and Wildlife doesn't want to see that type of use out there?
Yeah.
And also the other thing I want to kind of mention on there too, you probably, if you go to a number of different bayside public access areas, there are signs now that talk about, that address shellfish safety, and particularly noting that harvesting wild oysters in Delaware is illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah, so harvesting wild, we'll just start there. So the harvest of wild oysters without an oyster dealer or harvesting permit is most definitely illegal. It's not the case in every state. Oysters are unique in that they're one of the few seafoods that we eat raw, predominantly. That's, a lot of the shucking houses are canned and fried and that kind of thing. But there's a really high consumption of raw product. Because of that, the Delaware Department of Natural Resources has a division specifically focused on human health, countering things like bacterial growth. When you pull an oyster from the water, right, it's actively filtering, all of a sudden it shutters its valves. When it does that, it has a pocket of salt water trapped inside of it. Also within that pocket is naturally occurring bacteria. If you don't ice that oyster and properly take care of it, it'll grow bacteria that can potentially cause you to become nauseous, ill, throw up. Few cases, there's instances of death. So the raw oyster consumption is actually recommended not to be consumed by anyone that's immunocompromised or pregnant individuals for that reason. That said, all of our oyster producers adhere to something called a Vibrio management plan to control bacterial growth through icing and appropriate chilling measures. The Division of Fish and Wildlife, as far as I know, is concerned about oyster disease. This is not disease transferable to humans. This is oyster disease transferable to other oysters. That's what I've been told. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with some of their caution. I think some of it, I'll just leave it there. I'm not sure that I agree with every bit of precaution that they're taking, but that's what they cite, is an overabundance of caution. Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned, thank you, Mimi, was our legislative task force. That is something that Senator Stephanie Hansen started. Pete Schwarzkopf is the chair. There's a number of different legislators involved. I know Sophie Phillips is involved, and Russ Huxtable, as well as 2 individuals from academic agencies, myself and Dennis McIntosh, who's also involved in a lot of what we're doing. Shellfish farmers, all with an effort to help potentially grow shellfish aquaculture in the state of Delaware. That's its principal effort. And so hopefully, Bob, we can address some of those regulatory concerns through that way. I'm hopeful anyway.
I got a question.
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, you're trying to get some of these living shorelines going. What about oyster beds that are permanently underwater? Are you getting any of those reestablished?
Am I getting any of those reestablished? No. The permitting process for that is a nightmare. And so I will not go out and just do that for fun. I'd love to, and in fact, if you ever wanted to, I would help you. But it's a tremendous amount of work. As Bob mentioned, CIB, the Center for the Inland Bays, was held up for 3 years for subtitle, as far as I know, 3 years, for planting.
And counting.
What is it?
3 years and counting.
So 3 years to build 3 relatively small oyster beds. And the ecological effort and associated benefits are not, right, that's not just me, they know that. And so they have the same goal to produce subtidal oyster beds, right? We don't want to create an attractive nuisance where people come to harvest oysters, wind up getting sick and threatening our industry production. What we want to do is create habitat, create improvement to water quality, and create potentially a reduction in erosion. Those things, are what we're after. So yeah, I'm not personally after that. I'm after studying what's the impact. I actually have permits to do that in Delaware Bay, and it was a 9-month process to get a single permit, and that was fast. Center for the Inland Bays has waited for 3 years and counting, apparently, to get permitted for small oyster reefs in Rehoboth Bay. So I didn't even put in a permit to include Rehoboth Bay. I was just like, yep, I'm not even going there. So
Is this Denrec that issues the permits?
that is DENREC that issues the permits, yeah.
Okay.
What about establishing structure for the oysters to naturally attach to?
Another great idea. Less of a permitting issue, and I think you can encourage oyster recruitment, right? We have to be careful about planting anything on the bottom. Once you modify your bottom, you technically need a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permit. So I can talk to you more about that, but there's solutions out there that we could do to potentially seed with not just oysters, but other, benthic fauna that would potentially settle on it. Things like barnacles, things that we know will create habitat and a positive function. And I think that's the kind of creative thought process that we need. Frankly, I'd love to see CIB driving that. I'd love to see their permits acquired for what they've proposed and moving on to new potential adaptations and strategies for how we can improve water quality. That's an area that I want to really push into myself. So that's what we're after.
One of the slides you had showed a progression of a living shoreline, I think from 2014 to 2019 or something like that.
Yeah.
What was that shoreline constructed of?
So they used oyster castles in that one, and then oyster bags. It's actually an active body of research within the ecological restoration practitioner community, all fancy words for organizations like CIB, folks that are actually after trying to improve habitat. We're trying to get away from the use of black plastic bags and use naturally derived, coconut fibers, things that will eventually biodegrade with time. So with that particular application, I think they used oyster castles, which are just stacked cinder blocks, and then they effectively coated that with bags of oyster shells. And then the oysters will preferentially settle onto the shell. How you design individual shoreline installations varies from location to location. The water, as you all probably are aware, is very dynamic. It can be quite forceful, right? Particularly when you start looking at Delaware Bay, respectively. We have a high residence time, but we still have a significant amount of wave activity in Rehoboth Bay. It's even worse in Delaware Bay. So really strong currents that push and pull. And so how we actually design and engineer those solutions has to be thought about, but it's not novel, right? We've done this and we can do it. And I think people know how to get it done.
Hey, and real quick, I'm going to plug something. We talk about oyster shells on there. The center does have a active oyster shell recycling program. So if you like oysters and you eat oysters in the Delaware Inland Bays, I think most of the restaurants, we collect the shells and recycle them into these projects. So go eat more oysters. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, I would. That's what people ask me. They're like, well, what do I do? I'm like, go ask for a Rehoboth Bay oyster. That's what you should do.
Is that the area over in Fresh Pond where you see them,
Yes.
all those oyster
Yep,
shells?
that's us. Yep.
Good.
And the first, just next door at Bethany Oyster House, the first bit of shells that we got in the program came from him. I picked them up and brought them right over there. So there's Bethany's connection to oysters in the bays.
Great. Okay, do we have any more questions? Comments? Okay. Ed, thank you very much for coming. Yep. I know you're on a short schedule, so again, I want to make sure was it your daughters getting you picking up? Yeah. Don't want to miss that.
Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you for coming. Okay, our next item, Bob, I'm going to turn this one over to you because you've going to say a few words on the DNREC Living Shoreline Cost Share Program.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna, kind of as an announcement here. I did attend recently a virtual program by Kyla Clausen, who has a program through DNREC for cost share assistance for homeowners and homeowners associations for installing living shorelines. And there's a couple of requirements in it, but the program is intended for small projects and can reimburse up to 60% for installation. Homeowners in selected watersheds, including all of the inland bays watersheds, are eligible. The water must be tidal, and funding is via non-point source 319 funds or Chesapeake Bay implementation. Single landowners or HOAs are available. A number of design requirements, but rock can be used, some of these things are a little bit technical. I don't want to get into them, but contractors must have participated in the state living shoreline training program that's run through DNREC. There's also requirements for ongoing maintenance, and of course you have to have state and federal permitting on it. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, I can pass you off to Kayla, and she's in watershed stewardship at DNREC. Really, that's all I got on that.
Okay. Any questions relative to that? Okay. Thank you, Bob. Our next item is, I'm going to turn this over to Terry for a few minutes so she can kind of run through our current town projects and where things are relative to the county, the state, and all those fun things.
Good afternoon. I'll do my best. So the first item was the Loop Canal and the Assawoman Canal Bladder Dam. We've just recently applied for congressional directed spending, otherwise known to most people as earmarks. We applied with our two senators and our representatives, so hopefully at that point for the dam project, the construction of the dam. So at that point, we'll know something, but it is a slow process and nothing is guaranteed. First, we're applying through WRDA 2022, so that it's appropriated, but or approved but not appropriated. I always get that. It's so complicated. Anyway, so we are working on applying for funding. The Loop Canal, bulkhead, and
Terry,
living.
can I ask one?
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I understand you're working on the money and everything, and I know it's working its way through. I think engineering is pretty much complete or close.
We were working on the 60% and 100% and the final bid specifications, but we've also applied, and I should have mentioned that, we've also applied through FEMA with help for that. So there's not a lot of work we can do. We can just kind of tie up some, because once you start a project, then you can't get reimbursed for that money. So we're working toward it, but it is, and it's moving in the right direction. But we have applied for a FEMA grant for that, and hopefully, we applied for one last year, the COVID grant, and we did not get it due to lack of funding. But the project is a good project, and so we've applied through FEMA for help with the last 60% design plan, the 100% design plan, and the bid specs.
And it's
And they're working on it. In fact, we just, we're looking at the dam will require electricity and utilities, and we're working on establishing, what is available for that right now.
Okay.
I I seem to see that we already have $750,000, 250 plus your 500 you got, or,
I think you're talking about the,
That's designated for something
the-
else.
yeah, I think you're talking about the next project.
oh,
I-
okay.
Yep.
Yeah. But the permitting, it's still, we've gotten comments back, and I know the engineers are working on it.
They're working on it,
Right.
but we're also trying not to, do too much work before we get reimbursed, before we get a grant for it. So but we're definitely moving forward. It's just, there's a lot of i's to dot and t's to cross, because, we're looking at where we're gonna put it, and we have to get permission to put it where we want to.
Yeah, I think Parks and Rec is also involved somehow.
The National Park Service is involved, and DENREC is involved,
Yeah.
U.S. Park Service,
yes.
really?
Yep.
Interesting. Is it possible to see a copy of the 60% plans?
I think they're public information. It's online.
Okay. At
I
some
can,
point,
if you want to, yeah, I'll
okay,
get it
we'll
to you.
we'll catch up later.
Yep. So the Loop Canal bulkhead living shoreline, that's where we're going to put a bulkhead on the canal, and a living shoreline on the lake side of
The
that
spit.
that land strip. And so we recently heard that we were awarded $500,000 from congressional spending, so that we can proceed with the preservation of that land strip. And that'll probably be done in the off-season. But that was very good news, very excited about it.
That was through Lisa Blunt, Rochester.
Yes, and we were also granted, from our state representative and our state senator, Senator Hawker and Representative Gray, previous year, we were awarded money to help plan for the bulkhead.
Right.
CTF money?
It was community reinvestment money, yep.
And it was determined we don't need to have DENREC permits.
Right, we determined that if we build behind the mean high water line for the bulkhead, that we don't need permitting from Army Corps or DENREC.
Okay.
Which land strip are you talking about for the living
The
shoreline?
land strip that is, it fronts on the Lake Bethany, and then the other side of it, the back side of it, is the canal.
Yeah.
All right.
And
That
we
land
did some work out there earlier in the winter. They removed some fallen trees and things, and you can see that it's deteriorated. So we're very happy about being able to get started on this.
Yeah, just know there was some talk about the National Guard land strip, and I want to
No, it's
clarify.
not that. It is not that one.
Okay.
Okay, so the back-based study in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and DENREC placed the study on hold during the fall of 2023. We have recently heard, although not from the U.S. Army Corps or DENREC, that they've reached an agreement. But that was made, an announcement was made at the recent Association of Coastal, of a SCAT meeting, the Sussex County Association of Towns. And it was made by somebody that was doing a presentation, so hopefully that is true. He made it publicly, so, to a bunch of senators and representatives, so we're hoping that that is true, but no public announcement has been made yet by either DENREC or Army Corps. The DelDOT Route 1 initiative and how it impacts the town. I haven't received any updated information, although I'm sure everybody knows that they were working just north of the inlet bridge, and I do know that they're working to improve that area, but I haven't heard anything about how it would impact us.
Well, one thing, if I could, since we're on that, I'll
Absolutely.
mention it now, that I know that there was an article in the Coastal Point that there is a public hearing this Friday at the Hyatt in Dewey Beach.
Nice.
Public hearing that anybody can go to, where they are going to describe and go over in detail and show illustrations of the work that is coming up, starting momentarily during April, where they are upgrading the bulkheading on the north side, which is
Right.
where it breached,
Yes.
and also what they call tightening the sand on the south side. I don't know what tightening the sand means, but unless they're going to pump some sand across and bring the sand in, I don't know.
That's very good news.
So if anybody wants to get an update on the inlet, Dewey Beach, 11 o'clock, I think it is, on Friday, this Friday.
So
I'm
there-
sorry, go ahead.
There is a DENREC Shoreline Management Economic Study Workshop. This is, a year or so ago, DENREC announced that they didn't think that they would be able to continue funding our rehabilitation of the beach the way they had been. And they decided to do an economic study, and, you know, they made mention that, pretty strong mention, that they thought that some of the local communities, the beach communities, should start paying for that. So the Association of Coastal Towns, of which we are a member and of which our mayor is the current president, decided that, you know, we wanted to make sure that we address that, and we've been addressing it with our legislatures at the state. We recently, Association of Coastal Towns, on March 21st, met with, or actually had a meet and greet at Legg Hall. We were given a room by Senator Huxtable, and we actually met with a lot of senators and representatives in Legg Hall. And I think that went very well. What we're hearing from both Democrats and Republicans in Legg Hall is that they don't think this is going to happen because they recognize the value of the coastal economics and what we contribute, and they know that they've paid for it in the past, and they think they should continue paying for it. What happens is, so if you have strong feelings about this, and they've urged us, and I'll urge all of you, if you have strong feelings about this, please write your senator and your representative, because the more we express that, you know, we feel like we make a very substantial economic contribution to Delaware's economy, and we don't think that we should have to pay for beach replenishment here, the better off we will all be. So don't hesitate to, and everyone I've talked to has said that to me, and I'm sure the mayor will concur, that every legislator we talk to says the same thing. Don't hesitate to write them, and write them often, and write them about your feelings about the replenishment. So the last one, the monitoring stations for the tides. We have one installed at the Route 1 and the Loop Canal, and then we're planning to put one at the Assawoman. And to this point, they're working very well. I don't think they've been down at all. It's been a real help to us as we try to monitor what goes on here. So, and you can see that just by going to our website and doing search, do tidal search, and it will come right up. It's linked to our website.
Yeah, and what you do is, it gives you the
The height of the
height,
of the.
and then you can plug it in on the website,
Will's bringing it up. You
and it'll show you exactly where the water is in town.
can see the
moment.
elevations, right? You can see the elevations, and then when you plug it in down below, you can plug in. You can see what is happening
Yeah.
to the water in town.
Yeah,
It's-
you
it's-
just click on one of those heights, and it'll show you right where water flooding is going on
Yeah.
currently.
You can see why we need a dam.
Let's hope it doesn't get to that.
Yeah, we don't, yeah. So the U.S. Geological Service has been very helpful for us.
How is it progressing on the bridge over, there was supposed to be one added to the bridge over, close to where the Loop Canal comes out into the Assawoman?
Yes, I'm not sure of the progress that they're making there, but I do know that there is one plan for there, and I think there's a third one planned somewhere, but I'm not sure
Yeah,
exactly where.
further on down the
Yep.
Assawoman, I
Yeah,
believe.
oh, yeah, I think you're right, yes,
Right.
that's correct,
Thank you, Terry.
no problem.
Any questions? Matt, I'm going to let you discuss the Bethany homeowners help the town fight flooding.
Why, thank you, Ron. Yeah, so over the winter, Ron and I have put some A-frames out with some pamphlets and,
There's one right now out in the lobby, so.
and really burned through a lot. I mean, a lot of people are picking these up, so hopefully that will, promote some landscaping that helps us with the flooding issue we just saw on the screen. We put them out, and we've left them out for like during the week, and people still seem to be picking them up. There seems to be a lot of interest, and I think it'll only get more, especially as we move into the summer, where increased people through town, homeowners. That's
Yeah,
about
I think
all
so,
I
too.
got. Any
I've
questions?
been pleasantly surprised at how, and I hope they're, during the wintertime is when we get most of the owners here, the landowners, during the summertime, you got a lot of tourists, and so we really don't put it out during that time frame. But during the winter, I think we're hitting the right people, and hopefully, you know, people will take advantage and act accordingly.
I thought it was very attractive, by the way, the display. When I walk down the boardwalk, it catches my attention.
Well, good.
St. Patrick's Day, I think the A-frame I put up, like 70 pamphlets were taken, something like that.
Good.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
Go
Bill, you
ahead,
had a
Bill.
comment?
I have a question. I know a lot of neighbors are always complaining about, you know, the water and the water sits after. And a lot of it is because, quite frankly, the landscaping companies around here that come in and try to fix people's yards don't know diddly shit about what they're doing. And is there anybody that we can access in town that would have some expertise as far as grading and making sure that those lots, and when they're building new lots, that they don't do things wrong? And I know the town has building inspectors, and they do it when houses are being built, but as people re-landscape, they really just block off places where water needs to run out. And if you look in our neighborhood, I can show you 15 different spots where the landowners over time have put blocks into places where they shouldn't have put blocks that prevent the water from getting to where it should be. Is there somebody besides the town,
Well, I mean,
the
that's,
town
that's,
building department that really has the expertise to follow up on that? No, I mean,
I don't know. I mean, that's why the pamphlet is there. I mean, it's to try to reach some of these people so that they recognize on their own lots what they're doing and to do positive things, to open up for drainage, not block it. And, you know, I've seen lots over along Collins, for instance. There's a swale in the back there, and some people fill in their swale and some people don't. And what do? Somebody fills it in, but that's why we got this pamphlet out there, trying to reach some of these people to say, hey, don't block your swales, keep them open. You know, there are ways that you can do on your own lot. And in fact, one of our next items, John's going to talk about individual stormwater management ponds. So that'll be in just a minute. Okay. Any other thing?
No, I have
Okay.
nothing else.
Okay. Under, we're down to 9, which is a discussion of research and flood studies. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, and if, Will, could you bring that up? Will, could you bring that slide up of the, yep, that one right there. John, would you like to comment here?
My son bought a house recently in Cecil County, Maryland, which is in the headwaters of the Chesapeake Bay. So all new houses are required to have their own little stormwater management facility to capture a minimum of 50% of roof runoff. And this is approximately a bathtub-sized unit, length and width. It's probably a little wider. This was the first one they built, so it's a little wider than the bathtub. That's a 15-inch pipe that's in there with a trash but rack on it. So once it fills up to a certain point, which is probably about a foot to a foot and a half of water in that pond, it then overflows into an underground filter system. And then once it fills up, that pipe fills up, it then drains out to the street. So with all the rain problems we have with the town of Bethany, granted, town of Bethany's an old town, people didn't think about it, but all the impervious areas you look at least 50% of that's draining into the street. The other 50% may be draining into a canal behind the house. Well, if you put a system in like this, it could catch more than 50% runoff just from the house, which would help. And if it's designed properly, I think with the way that most of these yards are so flat, I think you'd almost catch 100% of it.
That may be something we might want to sit down and talk with Susan Fredericks, who's the inspector,
Yeah.
town inspector, and see what thoughts would be
The
on
town
that.
is Northeast Maryland, Cecil County.
That's incredible. Every house
Every
there
house
is
that they
required
just
to
put
have
in,
this?
the houses across the street in this picture have been there for probably 30 or 40 years. They don't have anything. All their yard stuff drains down into the local creek and into the Chesapeake. Up above that, they ended up have a big dam on a creek there, so that's kind of a universal stormwater management facility for everybody. He happens to be downstream of that, so there's 5 houses that just went in. All 5 houses have one of these in their front yard. Now, it doesn't have to be in their front yard. In this area, it could end up being in their backyard. And then it could drain to the front yard for its overflow.
Yeah, how big are those lots up there?
They're postage stamp size. I think his lot's no bigger than 5,000 square feet.
Really? 5,000 square feet? Okay. And these will hold the water and then let it drain out slowly,
That's correct.
or soak in?
Yes.
Yeah, it's basically, it's called either a bioswale or a rain garden, and the idea is to capture the rain and let it soak down into the groundwater, which is
Right.
the most important thing. What little I see here leads me to believe that there's a certain amount of elevation there. I don't know what the ground level location would be. I know that particularly the west side of Bethany, if you had that type of structure there, I think you'd be into groundwater pretty quick.
Yeah, that's a
But
problem around here.
what it is a sign of is people being innovative with with addressing their stormwater. May not work here, but it's definitely, it shows that there are alternatives that you can use in various places.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bob. Any comments? That's a good thing to look into. That may be some sort of an option that we can deal with. One other thing I wanted to just kind of briefly talk about was last week, Teresa Keel and myself got to go on what was called a Delmarva Waterways Tour, which was put on by the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And it was for municipal leaders throughout the Delmarva, so that's not just Delaware, that's Maryland, that's Virginia. And it was a good group of people that went. There were 30 of us. Most of them, I would say, were from Maryland. There was a good group from Delaware, and then a few people from the eastern shore of Virginia. And we got to see a number of different places, some saltwater intrusion into agriculture down in Virginia, some best management practices for chicken farming, which was down in the Salisbury area, but obviously not in Salisbury, way out a ways. Also, some preserved farmland through land trusts, some best management practices with cattle farming, and at that particular location, they produced cheese. Their business was cheese as well as the milk through the milk cooperatives. And then our next thing was tax ditches, and I'm like, what the hell's, excuse me, what's a tax ditch? And apparently, they're a very extensively used thing, and Sussex Conservation District is very involved in them. There's 144 of them in Delaware, isn't it? In Sussex County, okay, just in Sussex County, and we were looking at one over in Greenwood. And it's a very sophisticated group of ditches that have been constructed. They are on private land and usually between lots, and they drain into, in that particular case, it was the river. I don't remember which river, Chop Tank or some river. And they are maintained by what is called a tax ditch committee that they're regulated through Sussex Conservation and the state, and people within that area who have abutting land actually pay a tax that is handled through the county, I believe, and which is designed to maintain the various tax ditches. Quite interesting. I guess it works in some cases. The one place we looked at over in Greenwood, they had some issues with development and how it was, the tax ditch was functioning. So it was a problem area, and a gentleman with Sussex Conservation described us the situation and how it worked and anything. Anyway, but all in all, it was a very organized and very well-run tour. Some of it would relate to our area. The majority, I would say, would relate to more toward the inland areas of farming that we have so much of here in Delaware. But again, a very interesting trip. So, with that, I think we've reached the end. Do we have any?
So the Sussex County GIS has an online map about all the tax ditches in Sussex County. Oh, yeah, I do. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting map. You can see if you're looking at a piece of property, if there's a registered tax ditch associated with it.
Okay. Any other comments or anything? Questions? Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out. Thank everybody who was watching online. And Ed Hale was great today. And thank you for all the good comments we had here from our group, from our committee. Thank you for coming. I call adjourn.